Here's something that will surprise you. Richard Bong, America's deadliest fighter pilot with 40 confirmed kills, considered himself a terrible shot. In his own words, documented in letters home and repeated to fellow pilots, Bong admitted his gunnery accuracy was poor. His solution? Get so close to enemy aircraft that missing became physically impossible. In some cases, he flew through the exploding debris of planes he'd just destroyed. On one occasion, he actually collided with his target mid-air. This wasn't bravery. This was compensation, and it made him the most lethal pilot in American history. December 17, 1944, Tacloban Airfield, Leyte, Philippines. Major Richard Ira Bong climbed out of his P-38 Lightning after downing his 40th Japanese aircraft. Ground crews rushed forward cheering, slapping the fuselage of his plane. 40 kills, an unbreakable record that would stand for 80 years and counting. 5 days earlier, General Douglas MacArthur had personally pinned the Medal of Honor on Bong's chest. Now, with victory number 40, the farm boy from Wisconsin had cemented his place in history, but if you'd asked Bong about his secret, he wouldn't have talked about courage or skill. He would have shrugged and said, "I just get really, really close." This is the story of how the wrong techniques applied with absolute conviction created the right results. How a pilot who violated his own training manual became unkillable. How America's greatest ace succeeded not in spite of his limitations, but because he understood them perfectly. Richard Bong didn't master aerial combat. He hacked it. Chapter 1. The Immigrant Son Who Watched the Sky. September 24, 1920. Poplar, Wisconsin. Population, not enough to matter. Carl Bong, a Swedish immigrant who'd arrived in America with nothing, welcomed his first child into a world that offered no guarantees beyond hard work and harder winters. They named him Richard Ira. Everyone would call him Dick. The Bong farm sat on modest acreage that demanded everything and gave back just enough. Carl Bong brought with him the Swedish work ethic. Do your job, do it well, ask for nothing. His wife Dora managed a household that would eventually include 9 children. There was no room for laziness, no tolerance for excuses. Dick, as the oldest, learned responsibility early. Wake before dawn. Milk the cows, mend the fences, harvest the crops. The routine was grinding and endless. Most farm boys learned to hate it. Dick learned something different. He learned to wait. Patience wasn't a virtue on the Bong farm. It was survival. You waited for crops to grow. You waited for weather to break. You waited for injured animals to heal or die. You learned to watch, calculate, and act only when the moment arrived. These were not the skills anyone associated with fighter pilots, but they would make Dick Bong unstoppable. The summer of 1928 changed everything. President Calvin Coolidge decided to spend his vacation in Superior, Wisconsin, about 20 miles from the Bong farm. For 3 months, mail planes flew daily routes over Poplar, delivering correspondence to the presidential retreat. 8-year-old Dick would drop whatever he was doing when he heard the engines drone. He'd run to the highest point on the farm and watch the silver aircraft glide overhead, imagining himself at the controls. "That's when I knew," he later wrote to his mother. "Flying wasn't something I wanted to do someday. It was something I was going to do. Period." He started building model airplanes from scrap lumber and newspaper. His constructions were crude but functional. They glided properly because Dick had studied the real planes carefully. He drew aircraft in his school notebooks. He read every aviation magazine he could borrow or buy with saved pennies. But here's what made Dick different from other boys who dreamed of flying. He studied how things worked, not just how they looked. When a model crashed, he analyzed why. When a design flew well, he replicated the principles. He wasn't just a dreamer, he was an engineer in training. At Superior Central High School, Dick excelled without being exceptional. He graduated 10th in a class of 428 students, good but not valedictorian material. He played sports competently: baseball, basketball, hockey. He sang in the church choir, his voice pleasant but unremarkable. His teachers remembered him as quiet, focused, someone who completed assignments thoroughly but never raised his hand unless certain of the answer. In retrospect, this caution was telling. Dick Bong didn't like making mistakes. He preferred to be absolutely sure before committing. The one area where Dick showed genuine talent was hunting. Wisconsin's forests provided game, and the Bong family needed meat. Dick developed a reputation for rarely missing shots. He understood instinctively that patience mattered more than speed. Wait for the right angle. Account for distance and wind. Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it. Hurrying makes you miss, he told his younger siblings. Take your time, make the first shot count. This philosophy, precision over volume, patience over aggression, would define his aerial combat career, though he'd eventually abandon his own advice in the most spectacular way possible. Chapter 2. The Student Who Failed to Follow Instructions. Dick Bong enrolled at Superior State Teachers College, planning to become an engineer. The logical, methodical approach to problem-solving appealed to him, but aviation kept calling. When the civilian pilot training program opened, offering free flight instruction to college students, Dick signed up immediately. On his 20th birthday, September 24, 1940, he soloed for the first time in a Piper Cub. The instructor's report noted, "Student demonstrates unusual spatial awareness and mechanical aptitude. Landings require refinement. Tends to approach gunnery exercises with excessive caution." That last observation was prophetic. Throughout training, Dick's instructors praised his flying but questioned his aggression. He circled targets carefully, setting up perfect attack angles, then often held fire until the last possible moment. "Bong thinks too much," one instructor wrote. "In combat, hesitation kills you. He needs to develop a killer instinct." The irony would become apparent later. Dick didn't hesitate because he was scared. He hesitated because he was calculating. And when he finally committed, he committed absolutely. May 29, 1941. 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Dick Bong enlisted in the Army Air Force Aviation Cadet Program. He was 20 years old, stood 5'8", weighed 160 pounds, soaking wet. Nothing about his physical presence suggested future glory. But something caught the instructor's attention at Luke Field, Arizona. One of them was Captain Barry Goldwater, who would later become a United States Senator. In a 1982 interview, Goldwater recalled, "Bong had this quality I'd never seen before. Most cadets either flew by instinct or by the book. Bong did both simultaneously. He understood the mathematics of aerial combat better than pilots with 10 times his experience. Give him an enemy plane's speed, altitude, and heading, and he'd calculate the intercept angle in his head while maneuvering his aircraft. It was beautiful and terrifying." Another instructor was less charitable. Cadet Bong demonstrates exceptional technical knowledge. His deflection shooting calculations are textbook perfect. Unfortunately, his actual gunnery scores are below average. He overthinks the shot and fires late, or not at all. Unless he develops better instincts, combat will overwhelm him. Here's the fascinating contradiction. Dick Bong understood aerial gunnery theory better than almost anyone. He could explain deflection angles, lead calculations, bullet drop, convergence patterns. Put him in a classroom, he was brilliant. Put him in a cockpit with a moving target, and he suddenly became mediocre. The problem wasn't knowledge, it was application. Dick's analytical mind worked so quickly that he'd second-guess himself. Is the target really going that fast? Did I account for my own speed? What if he turns? Should I fire now or wait? By the time he decided, the opportunity had passed. On January 9, 1942, exactly 1 month after Pearl Harbor, Second Lieutenant Richard Ira Bong received his pilot wings and commission. His gunnery scores were good enough to pass, but nothing special. The Army made him a gunnery instructor at Luke Field. The logic was sound. Excellent theoretical knowledge makes for good teaching. Let the natural shooters go fight. Let Bong train them. For 6 months, Dick taught other pilots how to aim, lead, and fire. Every day he watched his students ship out to combat while he remained stateside. The frustration was intense. But those months teaching forced Dick to articulate concepts he understood intuitively. And in explaining deflection shooting to others, he finally understood why he struggled with it himself. The problem was range. Standard gunnery doctrine taught pilots to open fire at 300-400 yards and maintain fire through 200 yards. At those distances, lead calculations become crucial. A target traveling 300 mph will move 440 feet per second. Bullets from 50 caliber guns travel around 2,800 feet per second. Simple math, but in 3 dimensions with both planes maneuvering, the calculations become impossibly complex. Most pilots developed instincts through practice. Their brains learn to estimate lead without conscious calculation. It's like throwing a ball to a running receiver. You don't calculate the physics, you just do it. But Dick's brain refused to skip the calculation step. He insisted on understanding exactly why he was aiming where he aimed. This made him slow. The solution came to him one afternoon while teaching. If the math is too complex at 400 yards, what happens at 50 yards? At 50 yards, lead calculations become trivial. The target hasn't moved much. Point and shoot. Simple. Of course, attacking at 50 yards means closing to suicidal range. It means risking collision. It means flying through debris from destroyed aircraft. It means exposing yourself to defensive fire for longer. Every fighter pilot manual said, never get that close. Dick Bong decided, always get that close. When he finally mastered the technique, he wouldn't just be good, he'd be unstoppable. Chapter 3, The Stunt That Nearly Ended Everything, May 1942, Hamilton Field, California. Dick Bong reported for transition training on the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This twin-engine fighter would become his weapon, his partner, and eventually his widowmaker. The P-38 was unlike anything most pilots had flown. 2 Allison engines, counter-rotating to eliminate torque, twin booms holding the tail assembly, a central nacelle pod for the cockpit. It looked like someone had welded 2 planes together with a bathtub in the middle. Pilots either loved it immediately or never trusted it. Dick loved it. Why? Because the P-38 had one feature that perfectly matched his intended combat style. All guns mounted in the nose. Most fighters mounted guns in the wings. This created a convergence pattern. The bullets from left and right guns converged at a specific distance, usually 250-300 yards. Fire closer or farther, and your firepower dispersed. The P-38's nose mounting meant no convergence issues. 1 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns, all shooting parallel. At close range, this created a devastating concentration of fire. What Dick needed was a gun platform optimized for point-blank attacks. He'd found it. Training went well. Too well. Dick mastered the P-38's handling quickly and grew bored with repetitive exercises. His confidence, never his strong suit, began manifesting as cockiness. June 12, 1942, a date that would enter Air Force legend for all the wrong reasons. A fellow pilot had just gotten married. Dick decided to congratulate him by buzzing his house in a P-38, at full throttle, at rooftop height. The propeller wash tore shingles off the roof and scattered wedding decorations across the lawn. But Dick wasn't done. Flying low over downtown San Francisco, he roared down Market Street at building height. Pedestrians dove for cover. Office workers watched a twin-engine fighter flash past their windows. Then Oakland. Dick spotted clotheslines in a backyard and couldn't resist. He flew so low that his propeller wash tore freshly laundered sheets off the line and scattered them across the neighborhood. The woman whose laundry he destroyed filed an official complaint. General George C. Kenney, commanding the 4th Air Force, was not amused. He called Dick into his office for what should have been a career-ending meeting. "Lieutenant Bong," Kenney began, his voice icy. "You buzzed a house. You flew down Market Street at building height. You destroyed a woman's laundry with your propeller wash. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Dick, never eloquent under pressure, could only manage, "No excuse, sir." Kenny stared at him for a long moment, then delivered a reprimand that became legendary. "If you didn't want to fly down Market Street, I wouldn't have you in my Air Force. But you are not to do it anymore, and I mean what I say. Lieutenant Bong, Monday morning you will report to this address in Oakland. If that woman has any washing to be hung out on the line, you will do it for her. When the clothes are dry, you will take them off the line and bring them into her house. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Dick managed. But here's what mattered. Kenny didn't ground him permanently, didn't transfer him to a desk job, didn't end his fighter pilot career, because Kenny saw something in Dick Bong that transcended rule-breaking. He saw a pilot with exceptional skills who lacked only one thing: combat experience. When General Douglas MacArthur appointed Kenny to command 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, Kenny handpicked 50 of his best P-38 pilots to bring with him. Dick Bong was one of them. September 1942. Dick shipped out to Australia. He'd escaped punishment for his stunts and earned a coveted combat assignment. But he had no idea that his real education was about to begin, and his teacher would be a Japanese Zero. Chapter 4. The Education of a Killer. The Hard Way. Port Moresby, New Guinea. December 1942. Dick Bong arrived in the Southwest Pacific Theater, assigned to the 49th Fighter Group's 9th Fighter Squadron. There was just one problem. The 9th was still flying P-40 Warhawks, and Dick was trained only on P-38s. General Kenny temporarily attached him to the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, one of the few units already equipped with Lightnings. Dick would fly combat missions while waiting for his permanent unit to receive P-38s. This assignment changed everything. The 39th was commanded by Captain Thomas Lynch, a rising ace who understood something crucial about Pacific air combat. American pilots couldn't dogfight Zeros on equal terms. Lynch gathered new pilots, including Dick, for a brutally honest briefing. "The Zero is more maneuverable than anything we fly. It can outturn us, outclimb us at low altitude, and it's flown by pilots with, on average, 800 hours of combat experience. Many of you have less than 50 hours total flight time. If you try to dogfight them, they will kill you. Do you understand?" The pilots nodded uncertainly. "Here's what you're going to do instead," Lynch continued. "You will use altitude, you will use speed, you will attack from above, fire, and extend away. You will never slow down in a Zero's engagement envelope. You will never attempt to turn fight. Every one of you who forgets these rules will die. Am I making myself clear?" Dick absorbed every word. Lynch's tactics matched his own analytical approach. Understand your advantages, exploit them ruthlessly, avoid your weaknesses entirely. But theory and reality are different beasts. December 27, 1942. Allied coast watchers reported 40 Japanese aircraft heading toward Buna. 12 P-38s scrambled to intercept. Dick's heart hammered as he climbed toward 20,000 feet. His first combat mission, his chance to prove himself. Then he saw them, a massive formation of Japanese bombers escorted by Zero fighters, 40 enemy aircraft against 12 Americans. Most pilots would have felt fear. Dick felt something different. Opportunity. Lynch led the attack. Dick followed, pushing his throttles forward, diving toward a Zero, engaging Lynch's wingman. This was it. His moment. Everything he'd learned vanished. The Zero filled his gun sight. Dick's finger found the trigger. He squeezed off a burst, saw tracers arc toward the target, watched them pass harmlessly behind the Zero as it maneuvered. Miss. Dick corrected, fired again. Another miss. The Zero snap-rolled, reversing direction. Dick tried to follow, feeling the P-38 labor in the turn. The Zero was pulling away effortlessly. In that moment, Dick understood something terrifying. Theoretical knowledge meant nothing. He'd studied every manual, aced every written exam, understood deflection shooting better than his instructors, and he couldn't hit a damn thing. 3 more Zeros converged on his position. Dick abandoned the attack and dove toward the jungle canopy, using the P-38's superior dive speed to escape. He leveled out what he later described as 2 inches above the shortest tree in Buna and headed back to base. His first combat mission had been a humiliation. But something strange happened that night. While other pilots celebrated their victories or mourned their failures, Dick sat in his tent doing mathematics. He'd noted every shot he'd taken, estimated the range for each, 300-plus yards, calculated his deflection angles, 15 to 20 degrees off target axis, reviewed the Zero's evasive maneuvers, snap rolls, tight turns. Conclusion: at 300-plus yards, hitting a maneuvering Zero was nearly impossible for someone with his skill level. New plan required. The next morning, Dick approached Captain Lynch with a question. "Sir, what's the closest you've ever fired on an enemy aircraft?" Lynch thought about it. "Maybe 150 yards. Why?" "What if I could close to 50 yards?" Lynch stared at him. "You'd probably die. Flying through your target's debris, risking collision, exposing yourself to defensive fire, it's suicide. But would I hit? Yes, at 50 yards, even a terrible shot would hit." Dick nodded slowly. "Then that's what I'll do." Lynch tried to talk him out of it, explained the risks, showed him gun camera footage of pilots who'd tried close-range attacks and been killed by debris or collisions. Dick listened politely, then said, "Sir, I'm a poor shot at 300 yards. I might be adequate at 50 yards. I'd rather risk collision than miss entirely." Lynch finally shrugged. "Your funeral, kid." It would be 40 Japanese funerals instead. Chapter 5. The Birth of a Technique Through Trial and Error. January 7, 1943, Allied intelligence reported a Japanese convoy moving along the New Britain coast. 48 American fighters scrambled to attack. Dick flew with Lynch's formation, eager to test his new strategy. The engagement began at 1:15 p.m. at 18,000 feet. Dick spotted an Oscar fighter, Nakajima Ki 43, and dove to attack. This time, he didn't fire at 300 yards. He held his fire. 200 yards. Still holding 100 yards. The Oscar filled his entire windscreen, every rivet visible. 50 yards. Dick pressed the trigger. The combined firepower of one 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber guns converged on the Oscar's fuselage. For 1.5 seconds, 180 rounds struck home. The Oscar didn't just explode, it disintegrated. Pieces flew everywhere. Dick flew directly through the debris cloud. Metal fragments pinged off his canopy and fuselage. For one terrifying moment, he couldn't see anything except smoke and wreckage. Then he was through, climbing away, adrenaline making his hands shake. Behind him, the Oscar's remains tumbled toward the ocean. First kill. The technique worked, but barely. Dick's P-38 had absorbed minor damage from debris. A piece of the Oscar's wing had struck his right engine cowling, 6 inches different, and it might have taken out the engine entirely. Suicidal? Absolutely. Effective? Undeniable. After refueling at Dobodura, Dick took off again at 3:30 p.m. Another formation of 16 Japanese fighters appeared. Dick repeated his attack. Wait. 50 yards. Fire. Another Oscar exploded. Dick flew through the debris again, collecting more scratches and dents. 2 kills in one day. That evening, Captain Lynch called Dick into his tent. "You're either the bravest pilot I've ever seen or the craziest," Lynch said. "Probably both. But I watched your gun camera footage. Your technique is insane, but it works. Every bullet is hitting. 0 deflection error because—" "You're so close, deflection barely matters." Lynch paused. "If you keep doing this, you'll either become an ace or die in a fireball. Possibly both on the same mission." Dick nodded seriously. "I understand, sir." "Do you, though? Because I'm telling you right now, what you're doing violates every safety protocol we have." "Yes, sir, but I also know I can't hit at 300 yards, and if I can't hit, I can't contribute. I'd rather take risks and be useful than play it safe and be useless." Lynch studied him for a long moment. Finally, "Fair enough, but for God's sake, try not to fly through quite so much debris." Over the next month, Dick refined his technique through systematic experimentation. Each mission taught new lessons. Lesson 1. Attacking from directly behind meant flying through debris. Solution. Attack from a slight angle, 10 to 15 degrees off axis. The target still exploded, but Dick could angle away from the worst debris. Lesson 2. Some targets exploded more violently than others. Bombers with full fuel tanks created massive fireballs. Fighters carried less fuel and exploded less dramatically. Dick learned to identify high-risk targets and attack them last if possible. Lesson 3. Speed was everything. Dick needed to close fast, fire, and escape before defensive fire or other enemy fighters could respond. He practiced diving attacks that built maximum velocity, allowing quick getaways. Lesson 4. Most critically, target fixation was the real killer. Dick couldn't afford to watch his victims fall, fire, break away immediately, return to altitude. Hesitation meant death. By January 8, 1943, Dick had 5 confirmed kills. He'd officially become an ace. More importantly, he'd become something else, a pilot who'd turned a weakness into a super weapon. His poor long-range gunnery meant nothing at 50 yards. At that distance, pointing the aircraft at the target was sufficient. His mathematical brain, which slowed him down at distance, worked perfectly at close range. Calculations became trivial. Just get close enough. Word spread through the 5th Air Force. Pilots heard about the crazy kid who flies through debris clouds. Some tried to copy his technique. Most failed. The mental discipline required to hold fire until the last possible moment was rare. But a few pilots succeeded, and Dick became their unofficial instructor. He taught them the principles. Never commit to an attack unless you can close to 100 yards minimum, preferably 50. If you can't get that close, don't fire. You're just wasting ammunition and giving away your position. Wait for the perfect setup. Speed is survival. Dive fast. Shoot fast. Leave fast. Slow equals dead. Accept that you'll get hit by debris sometimes. The P-38 is tough. It can take minor damage. What it can't take is enemy fire from multiple fighters because you stuck around admiring your kill. Never attack when angry or excited. Emotion makes you rush. Rushing makes you sloppy. Sloppy makes you dead. This last principle defined Dick's entire combat philosophy. He never fell victim to victory fever, the adrenaline-fueled excitement that made pilots chase enemies too far or take stupid risks. Every attack was calculated. Every decision was measured. He was mechanical, precise, almost cold-blooded. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with him reported something chilling. The American pilot with red-marked wingtips didn't just shoot them down. He executed them. By April 1943, Dick had 10 confirmed kills, a double ace in 4 months. General Kenney promoted him to first lieutenant and began talking about him in reports back to Washington. "We've got a farm boy from Wisconsin who's figured out how to kill Japanese aircraft with mathematical precision. His technique is unorthodox but devastatingly effective." The War Department started paying attention. America needed heroes, and Richard Bong was becoming one. But Dick's greatest challenges still lay ahead. Because someone else was also racking up kills in the Pacific Theater. His name was Thomas McGuire, and he wanted to be number 1. Continued in next section due to length. Chapter 6, The Race Nobody Asked For. Thomas Buchanan McGuire Jr. arrived in the Southwest Pacific in March 1943, assigned to the same theater as Dick Bong. Where Dick was quiet and methodical, Tommy McGuire was loud and competitive. Where Dick avoided attention, Tommy sought it. Where Dick deflected credit, Tommy kept meticulous records of every victory. They were opposites in every way except one. Both were exceptional pilots, flying P-38 Lightnings. McGuire started slowly, scoring his first kills in August 1943. But once he found his rhythm, his score climbed rapidly. By late 1943, people began talking about a rivalry between Bong and McGuire. Dick hated it. "There's no competition," he wrote to his parents. "Tommy's a great pilot. We're both just doing our jobs. The Japanese are the enemy, not each other." But Tommy saw things differently. In letters to his wife, Pudgy, he wrote openly about wanting to break Bong's records. "I'm going to be the top ace," he promised her. The two pilots actually got along well personally. They flew missions together, swapped tactics, even shared a drink on occasion. But the press seized on the rivalry angle, printing scorecards tracking their kills like baseball statistics. By April 1944, Dick had 27 kills, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26. Tommy had 22 and was climbing fast. Then Dick got orders: report back to the United States for a war bond tour. General Kenny's reasoning was strategic. Dick's value as propaganda now exceeded his value in combat. America needed heroes, and the modest farm boy who'd become the nation's top ace was perfect for the role. Tommy saw opportunity. With Bong out of theater, he could close the gap. Instead, he got malaria and dengue fever. For months, Tommy lay in hospital beds, his temperature spiking to 105 degrees, unable to fly, while Dick toured America selling war bonds. The race was on hold, but it would resume in spectacular fashion, and it would end in tragedy. Chapter 7. The War Bond Tour and the Girl from Superior. Spring 1944. Richard Bong returned to the United States as the man who'd broken Eddie Rickenbacker's record. The press couldn't get enough of him. Life magazine wanted photo spreads, radio shows, requested interviews. The War Department designed a 15-state tour to maximize his propaganda value. Dick hated every minute. "I belong in a cockpit, not on a stage," he wrote to his parents. "Every day I spend here is a day I'm not helping my squadron mates. They're still fighting while I'm signing autographs." But orders were orders. For 2 months, Dick traveled from city to city, giving speeches to crowds that saw him as a superhero. He visited aircraft factories, telling workers their efforts directly supported pilots like him. He met with wounded servicemen in hospitals, offering quiet encouragement. The tour accomplished its goals. War bond sales surged. Factory productivity increased. Enlistment spiked. Richard Bong's face appeared on recruiting posters. "America's ace of aces needs your support." But something unexpected happened during a homecoming event at Superior State Teachers College. Her name was Marjorie Vattendahl. She was beautiful, intelligent, and studying to be a teacher. Dick was immediately smitten. He, who could face down Japanese fighters without fear, became tongue-tied around this college girl. Their first conversation, according to witnesses, went something like, "Dick, hello? Marge, you're Richard Bong. I've read about you." Dick, "Yes." Marge, 27 Japanese aircraft. Dick, "Yes." Marge, "That must be very difficult." Dick, "Sometimes." Marge, "Would you like to get coffee?" Dick, "Yes." Not exactly smooth, but genuine, and Marge saw past the awkwardness to the decent man underneath. They began dating immediately. For Dick, who'd spent 3 years in combat surrounded by death and violence, Marge represented something he'd almost forgotten existed: normalcy, a future beyond war. When Dick returned to the Pacific in September 1944, he carried a large photograph of Marge. He had it mounted on the nose of his P-38 Lightning, just below the cockpit. The aircraft was officially named Marge. Unlike other pilots who painted provocative pin-up girls on their planes, Dick chose a respectful photograph of his girlfriend. His sister would later recall, "He didn't have the nude figures like some pilots. He had a picture of a beautiful girl he respected." The red-painted wingtips and propeller spinners remained. Japanese pilots had learned to recognize and fear those markings. But now the aircraft carried something else: a promise. Dick intended to survive this war and marry that girl. Chapter 8. the instructor who couldn't stop fighting. September 1944. Dick Bong returned to find the war had changed. American forces were pushing toward the Philippines. Japanese air power, though diminished, still mounted fierce resistance. Kamikaze attacks were beginning, suicide missions that terrified sailors but provided opportunities for intercepting pilots. General Kenny had a problem. Dick was too valuable to lose, but too skilled to completely ground. The solution was elegant. Kenny assigned Dick to 5th Air Force Headquarters as an advanced gunnery instructor. His orders explicitly stated he could fly missions but was not required to actively seek combat. Dick found the loophole within hours. The orders said he couldn't seek combat. They didn't say he couldn't respond if combat found him. Flying from Tacloban Airfield on Leyte, Dick managed to be in exactly the right place whenever Japanese aircraft appeared. His victory total climbed steadily, 28, 30, 32, 35. Kenny knew what Dick was doing but couldn't quite prove it. Instructor missions kept encountering enemy fighters. Navigational training flights somehow resulted in aerial victories. The general walked a tightrope. He wanted Dick to reach 40 kills, a round, memorable number perfect for propaganda. But he didn't want to lose America's greatest ace to a lucky Japanese shot. Meanwhile, Tommy McGuire had recovered from his illnesses and returned to combat with renewed determination. He'd scored 21 kills before his medical troubles. Now, in late 1944, he went on a tear. October, 3 kills. November, 4 kills. Early December, 2 kills. Tommy had 30 total kills. Dick had 36. The gap was narrowing. Then came Christmas 1944, December 25, 26. Tommy McGuire flew 2 of the most incredible missions of the Pacific War. On Christmas Day, he shot down 3 Japanese fighters while escorting bombers to Mabalacat Airdrome. His P-38 was damaged by enemy fire. One of his guns jammed. Most pilots would have headed home. Tommy stayed in the fight, using his aircraft as a weapon, diving at enemy fighters, disrupting their attacks on bombers, forcing them to evade rather than press home their own attacks. For half an hour, he flew with non-functioning guns, protecting bombers through pure aggression and maneuvering. The next day, December 26th, Tommy returned and shot down 4 more Japanese fighters in rapid succession. 7 kills in 2 days. His total, 38. Dick Bong had 38 as well. He'd had shot down 2 more in mid-December. They were tied. And now General Kenny faced a dilemma. Whoever scored next would break the tie and claim the lead. If Tommy surpassed Dick while Dick was still in theater, it would steal thunder from the carefully planned celebration of Bong's achievements. So Kenny did something that remains controversial. He temporarily grounded Tommy McGuire. The official reason, administrative duties required. The real reason, give Dick time to reach 40 kills and then send him home permanently before Tommy could catch him. It was calculated, it was strategic, and it probably saved Dick Bong's life while ultimately costing Tommy McGuire his. Chapter 9, The Final Kills and the Medal, December 12, 1944. Tacloban Airfield, Leyte. General Douglas MacArthur himself flew in to present Richard Bong with the Medal of Honor. MacArthur, famous for theatrical speeches, looked at the modest pilot from Wisconsin and said, "Major Richard Ira Bong, who has ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines, I now induct you into the society of the bravest of the brave, the wearers of the Congressional Medal of Honor of the United States." Fighter aircraft lined the runway. Hundreds of servicemen stood at attention in tropical heat. Newsreel cameras captured everything. Dick, visibly uncomfortable with the ceremony, stood stiffly as MacArthur pinned the medal on his uniform. His citation listed 40 victories, leadership, devotion to duty, extraordinary heroism. But Dick had only 38 kills. Kenny and MacArthur knew this. They also knew Dick was going home in a month. The ceremony was scheduled now for maximum propaganda impact. Having America's greatest ace receive the nation's highest honor from MacArthur personally in the Philippines made for perfect imagery. The assumption, Dick would get 2 more kills before going home, making the citation accurate retroactively. 5 days later, December 17, 1944, Dick flew his final combat mission. A formation of Japanese fighters appeared over Mindoro. Dick dove to attack, selected a target, closed to his usual suicidal range, and fired a 3-second burst. The Japanese fighter exploded. Dick angled through the debris one last time, climbed back to altitude. Kill number 40, perfect, exactly as planned. Except Dick still had fuel, ammunition, and time before returning to base. He could have sought more targets. He could have added to his total. Instead, he headed home. Later, when asked why he hadn't continued hunting, Dick said simply, 40 seemed like enough. It was the most Dick Bong answer possible. No drama, no celebration. Just, that'll do. Behind the scenes, both MacArthur and Kenny breathed sighs of relief. The plan had worked. Bong reached 40, received his Medal of Honor, and could now be sent home before combat claimed him. Tommy McGuire, still grounded for administrative reasons, heard about Dick's 40th kill and congratulated him genuinely. No bitterness, just respect from one skilled pilot to another. "I'll break your record someday," Tommy told him. "I hope you do," Dick replied honestly. "That would mean you survived long enough to do it." January 1945. Major Richard Bong boarded a transport aircraft for the United States. His combat career was over. He'd flown over 200 missions, logged 500-plus hours of combat flight time, and achieved 40 confirmed victories. Most remarkably, he'd never lost a wingman. In aerial combat, where many aces accumulated kills while their wingmen died protecting them, Dick's record was extraordinary. He treated wingmen as partners, positioned them to support attacks, while keeping them out of maximum danger. This loyalty earned fierce devotion from those who flew with him. Years later, when asked about Dick Bong, his former wingmen all said variations of the same thing. "He made me better. He kept me alive. I'd have followed him anywhere." As Dick's transport lifted off from Tacloban, he watched the Philippines disappear below. 3 years of combat ending. He was going home, to Marge, to a future beyond killing. He'd done his job. Now he could rest. Or so he thought. Chapter 10. Tommy McGuire's Last Flight. January 6, 1945. General Kenny lifted the administrative hold on Tommy McGuire. With Bong safely stateside, Tommy could resume hunting for his 39th and 40th kills. January 7, 1945. Tommy led a flight of 4 P-38s on a fighter sweep over Negros Island. His wingmen, Major Jack Rittmeyer, Captain Edwin Weaver, and Lieutenant Douglas Throp. Their mission, hunt for Japanese aircraft. Tommy was desperate for kills. He had 38. Just 2 more would tie Bong's record. 3 would break it. Over Fabrica Airfield, they spotted a lone Oscar fighter. 4 American fighters versus 1 Japanese plane. Should have been simple. Except the Oscar was flown by Warrant Officer Akira Sugimoto, an instructor pilot with over 3,000 hours of flight time, one of Japan's best. Tommy dove to attack. The Oscar evaded. Tommy's wingman Weaver tried to position for a shot. Sugimoto outmaneuvered him effortlessly. Then Sugimoto reversed and locked onto Weaver's tail. This was the critical moment. Tommy had written extensive tactical manuals. He'd taught dozens of pilots. His combat doctrine included one absolute rule: never slow down at low altitude, never engage in a turning fight below 5,000 feet, never sacrifice speed for position in the danger zone. Tommy violated all 3 rules. He pulled his P-38 into a tight turn to get behind Sugimoto and save his wingman. But Tommy was still carrying his auxiliary fuel tanks. He hadn't jettisoned them. The extra weight and drag meant his fighter couldn't sustain the high G-turn. At 300 feet altitude, Tommy's P-38 stalled. The lightning snap rolled left and slammed into the jungle. Tommy McGuire died instantly. He was 24 years old. He'd sacrificed himself to save his wingman, the ultimate act of courage. For this, he'd received the Medal of Honor posthumously. But he died 2 kills short of tying Dick Bong's record. When Dick heard the news in California, he was devastated. He and Tommy had been rivals only in the media's imagination. In reality, they'd been fellow professionals who respected each other's skills. Tommy was a great pilot, Dick said quietly. He did what any good lead should do, protected his wingman. He died a hero. What Dick didn't say, but surely thought, Tommy died because he tried too hard to match a record that didn't matter. The race had been artificial, created by journalists and encouraged by competitive instincts. And it had killed one of America's finest pilots. Chapter 11, Marge and the Dream of After February 10, 1945, Concordia Lutheran Church, Superior, Wisconsin. The wedding took place on a brilliantly cold winter day. Marjorie Vattendahl wore a traditional white gown. Dick wore his Army Air Force dress uniform, Medal of Honor prominently displayed. The church overflowed with family, friends, townspeople, and journalists documenting America's ace of aces gets married for papers across the nation. For Dick, who'd spent 3 years surrounded by death, the wedding represented something almost incomprehensible. Normalcy, a future, plans that extended beyond tomorrow's mission. In his vows, Dick promised Marge a life free from danger. He spoke of building a home, starting a family, pursuing aviation in peaceful skies. The dreams were simple but profound for someone who'd survived countless attempts on his life. The honeymoon, California. Because Dick had accepted a position with Lockheed Aircraft Corporation as a test pilot for their new P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. It seemed perfect. Dick could apply his combat experience to developing next-generation aircraft. He'd help create the fighters that future pilots would fly. Challenging work without the mortal danger of combat. Test flying was risky, certainly, but after 3 years of Japanese fighters trying to kill him, testing jets seemed almost safe by comparison. The P-80 Shooting Star represented a revolution in aviation. No propellers. A jet engine buried in the fuselage. Top speed, 594 mph, nearly 200 mph faster than the P-38. Dick loved it immediately. The speed, the responsiveness, the raw power. This was the future of flight. He accumulated 4 hours and 15 minutes of P-80 flight time across 12 flights. By test pilot standards, he was still learning the aircraft's quirks. By his own fighter pilot standards, he was comfortable. August 6, 1945. Dick reported to Lockheed's Burbank facility for a routine acceptance flight of P-80A tail number 44-85048. The pre-flight inspection showed nothing unusual. Dick started the Allison J-33 turbojet normally. The jet engine's whine was markedly different from the roar of the Allison pistons he'd flown throughout his combat career. He taxied to the runway, received clearance for takeoff at 2:30 p.m. Witnesses watched the sleek jet begin its takeoff roll, clean acceleration, rotation at proper speed, liftoff smooth and professional. At approximately 300 feet, the engine coughed black smoke. The P-80 began rolling right. Dick corrected. The aircraft leveled momentarily. Then the engine failed completely. Dick had seconds to decide, try to restart or bail out. The P-80 had an auxiliary fuel pump that could be activated manually. A switch on the left console, flip it, and the pump would bypass the failed primary system. Another test pilot, Captain Ray Crawford, had mentioned that Dick once forgot to activate this pump during an earlier flight when the primary failed. Dick had caught the error and corrected it mid-flight, but he'd been warned, don't make that mistake again. Nobody knows if Dick forgot the auxiliary pump this time or if he simply didn't have time to reach it before the engine died. What we know, the P-80 pitched nose down. Dick ejected clear of the aircraft, his parachute deployed, canopy snapping open, but he was only 200 feet above the ground. There wasn't enough time or altitude for the parachute to slow his descent. Dick struck the ground at the intersection of Oxnard Street and Satsuma Avenue in Burbank at high velocity. Emergency crews reached him within minutes. America's greatest fighter ace, survivor of 200 combat missions and countless aerial battles, had died instantly in a California suburb. He was 24 years old. Chapter 12, The Cruelest Irony, August 7, 1945. Newspapers across America placed two stories side by side. Atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima, America's top ace killed in test flight. The juxtaposition was devastating. On August 6th, the same day Dick died, the Enola Gay had dropped an atomic bomb on Japan. The weapon that would end the war had been unleashed. Dick Bong survived 3 years of combat against the Japanese Imperial Air Force. He flew over 200 missions. He engaged in hundreds of aerial battles. He emerged without a scratch. Then he died testing an American aircraft on the same day the atomic bomb signaled the war's approaching end. The symbolism was crushing. Here was the ultimate warrior, killed not by enemies, but by mechanical failure. Not in glorious combat, but in a routine test flight. Not before victory, but on the very day victory became inevitable. Marge Bong, married less than 6 months, was destroyed. In interviews decades later, her pain remained fresh. Dick survived everything Japan could throw at him. Every day for 3 years, I didn't know if he'd come home. Then he came back. We had plans. We were going to build a life. And then, gone. In an instant. Because a fuel pump failed. The funeral in Poplar drew thousands. Military honor guards. General Kenny himself, openly weeping. Marge walking behind the casket, supported by family, wearing black and trying to maintain dignity while her world collapsed. The gravestone was simple. Richard Ira Bong Major, United States Army Air Forces. September 24, 1920. August 6, 1945, Medal of Honor. America's Ace of Aces, 40 victories. Below the inscription, a carved P-38 Lightning in flight. The Swedish immigrant's eldest son, who once watched mail planes fly over his family's farm and dreamed of touching clouds, was home at last. Chapter 13, The Record That Stands Alone. 79 years have passed since Richard Bong's death. His record of 40 aerial victories remains unbroken by any American pilot. This isn't for lack of opportunity. American pilots fought in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Jets replaced propellers. Missiles replaced guns. Air combat evolved beyond recognition, but nobody has matched. 40 kills. Why? Several reasons. Technology changed. Modern fighters use beyond visual range missiles. Engagements happen at miles of distance, decided in seconds. The extended dogfights of World War II, where skilled pilots could accumulate multiple kills per mission, don't happen anymore. Air superiority. America achieves air dominance quickly in conflicts. After initial fighting, enemy aircraft become scarce. Pilots can go entire tours without engaging enemy fighters. Mission doctrine. Modern fighter pilots perform multiple roles: air-to-air, air-to-ground, reconnaissance. They don't specialize in air superiority the way World War II aces did. Target availability. Simply put, there aren't enough enemy aircraft. In Desert Storm, the entire war produced fewer than 40 Iraqi aircraft shot down by U.S. forces combined. Dick Bong's record stands as a monument to a specific time and style of warfare that will never return. Chapter 14. The methodology behind the myth. So what really made Dick Bong successful? Let's analyze the components. He understood his limitations. Dick knew he couldn't shoot accurately at range. Instead of trying to overcome this weakness through endless practice, which might have worked eventually, he fundamentally changed his approach. Can't hit it at 300 yards? Get to 50 yards. This is the essence of strategic thinking. Exploit strengths, eliminate weaknesses. He accepted risk others wouldn't. Flying through debris clouds, risking collisions, exposing himself to fire by closing too much. These were risks most pilots avoided. Dick calculated that these risks were preferable to the certainty of missing at long range. He never panicked. Combat reports consistently note Dick's calm radio communications, even in desperate situations. While others shouted warnings and curses, Dick made concise tactical calls. This psychological control came from natural temperament plus combat experience. He learned from every mission. After each flight, Dick debriefed thoroughly. He studied gun camera footage, analyzed what worked and what didn't. He treated aerial combat like an engineering problem. Test, measure, adjust, repeat. He protected his wingmen. Dick never lost a wingman under his direct leadership. This wasn't luck. It was careful positioning and tactical awareness. He could track multiple aircraft simultaneously while keeping his wingmen out of maximum danger. He knew when to disengage. Unlike many aggressive pilots, Dick never chased damaged enemies too far or allowed victory fever to override judgment. If an engagement turned unfavorable, he'd leave without hesitation. Dead heroes are still dead. He taught others. By articulating his techniques to new pilots, Dick refined his own understanding. Teaching forced him to analyze instinctive actions and explain them logically. All these factors combined to create America's deadliest aerial warrior. Chapter 15. The Japanese Perspective. What did Japanese pilots think about? Richard Bong. Captured documents and post-war interviews provide fascinating insights. Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace with 64 confirmed kills, wrote extensively about American pilots in his memoir, Samurai. Though he couldn't identify Bong by name, several descriptions almost certainly refer to him. There was a lightning pilot with red markings who was especially dangerous. He didn't fight like other Americans. He didn't try to outmaneuver us. He knew the Zero was more agile. Instead, he attacked from above at tremendous speed, fired at impossibly close range, and was gone before we could respond. Our veterans warned new pilots, if you see the red lightning, break formation and run. To face him was death. Another Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Kenji Okamoto, wrote in his diary, discovered in military archives decades later, "Intelligence calls him the Ghost. He chooses when to fight. We can only react. Our commanders now instruct us to avoid engagement with twin-boom fighters marked red. This admission of fear is shameful, but survival is more important than pride." This psychological impact, making enemy pilots afraid to engage, was perhaps Dick's greatest achievement. Every Japanese pilot who chose to run rather than fight him saved American lives indirectly. Epilogue. The Legacy of an Imperfect Ace. Richard Ira Bong flew his last combat mission on December 17, 1944. He died testing a jet fighter on August 6, 1945. He lived only 24 years, married for less than 6 months, experienced combat for less than 3 years. Yet his influence persists. Tactical doctrine, the techniques Dick pioneered, close-range firing, energy management, boom and zoom attacks, became standard curriculum at fighter pilot training schools. Engineering input, his combat reports influenced P-38 modifications and informed design choices for future fighters. Inspiration. Generations of fighter pilots have studied his career, learning from his successes and his willingness to adapt. The memorials exist, airports, bridges, museums, bearing his name. But the real legacy is more subtle. Every fighter pilot who closes to optimal firing range before shooting, that's Dick Bong's influence. Every pilot who maintains situational awareness while protecting wingmen, that's Dick's example. Every pilot who analyzes combat footage to improve performance, that's Dick's methodology. The farm boy from Wisconsin who once watched mail planes and dreamed of flying changed aerial warfare not through natural talent or technological advantage, but through brutal honesty about his own limitations and ruthless determination to overcome them. He couldn't shoot accurately at 300 yards, so he developed tactics that made 300-yard shooting irrelevant. He wasn't the most naturally gifted pilot, so he became the most analytical. He wasn't fearless, so he became disciplined enough that fear couldn't control him, and in doing so, he became the deadliest American fighter pilot in history. 40 confirmed victories, a record that stands 79 years later. A testament to what's possible when you understand yourself perfectly and refuse to accept limitations as final. Dick Bong didn't master the art of aerial combat. He redefined it. The thunder of his guns has faded. The skies he ruled are peaceful now. But the legend of the imperfect marksman who got close enough that perfection didn't matter will echo through history forever. He was just doing his job, and he did it better than anyone ever has.